Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Caudill. I hope that you're doing well. I'm doing okay. We're still in evolution. That's a good thing. Um, we are getting towards the end of 24.2, and my favorite things about evolution, other than the concept itself, are the activities. We're going to do a few labs in class. We'll watch some movies in class. There's a lot of experiments that have been done that have substantiated the theory of evolution and are really interesting. And starting in 24.2, we start to see a lot of these experiments, and they'll just talk to you about them in these paragraphs. I think that they're fascinating. I've read every word that I've asked you to read, and I would like you to spend your time going through these things. You don't have to memorize anything, but just understand, because you might see them again on the test, and I'll say, okay, reread it here on the test, understand it again. What do you gather from this? We're going to go all the way till the end of the chapter here, and there's really not many notes on the board or not too much to say. A lot of this is kind of touched upon in 10th grade biology, but I think it's fascinating personally, and I hope you do too. What I've done is I've set up maybe 20 minutes of talking, and then I have a 14-minute video set up at the end of this, and then I'll ask you a question. If the video doesn't look right to you, like if you're like, wow, I want better quality, just go to my platform. Right now it's Google Classroom, but we'll see what it is in the future. And the movie's there. You just upload it from there. Thanks. Let's begin. I'd like you to write this down. Speciation can take place with or without geographic separation. Think about speciation. I guess the divergence of two groups of populations from one original species of population that was a certain species, and then eventually they become so different that they can no longer reproduce and have fertile, viable offspring. And you can see in this picture here, there's a lake, and then you can see on the left side that there's two populations, and there's also two populations on the right, but the difference between the two is geographic isolation. You can see that kind of sandbar there between the two lakes on the left side. We're going to get to both ideas of how this happens. The first is called allopatric speciation. That's on the left, and then there's sympatric speciation on the right. You gotta memorize these. You can write that down if you'd like, for sure. Well, allopatric literally means other country. I learned this at a conference once. This lady said, the way I teach it is I have someone on one side of a ravine, and they're calling to their friend, hello, Patrick, and Patrick's on the other side of the canyon. And the idea is that there's a geographic barrier between them. Now that they're isolated on either side of the geographic barrier, their populations can undergo those things that Hardy and Weinberg told us are important for the changing of allele frequencies in a population. Things like gene flow, non-random mating, selection due to the natural environment, genetic drift. All those things can now start to happen on those populations. And then if they change so much that they can no longer reproduce their different species. But this is geographic isolation. An example that you're going to get in your textbook is from these chipmunks. This is the Grand Canyon here, and you're going to see, hey, Rob, hey, you're going to see, can I talk to you in a minute? Yeah. Okay, thank you. You're going to see that what they're suggesting is that the two species, that's my boss. The two species of chipmunk were once a single population. Let's imagine that the Colorado River started cutting through this Colorado plateau many, many millions of years ago, and it has now exposed all this rock that we like to look at and call the Grand Canyon and see pretty colors on at sunset and stuff. But the point is, for these chipmunks, what happened was some of them got into different environments on different sides of this river that was cut in this canyon, and then all of a sudden, over time, they became two separate species as a result of natural selection, mutation, and genetic drift that occurred in their populations. But this is a pretty important figure. It's 24.13. Make sure that you go here and take a look at this. And what it's showing, so I'll go back, what it's showing is that you have a population here. There's gene flow going between these different populations. Everything's fine. And then all of a sudden, there's some sort of barrier. And that could be a geographic barrier, for instance. And we'll learn in sympatric speciation when it isn't a geographic barrier. This population is then going to diverge over time as far as their alleles are concerned. And you can see the other populations are doing just fine. They're on the bottom fork of this picture. Well, there is an opportunity for them to get back together, and this is called the hybrid zone, meaning sometimes they can get back together and maybe it's okay. They're going to reproduce, they're going to create babies, everything's okay, but then sometimes maybe they won't be able to create babies, or maybe they'll create these feeble, non-viable babies, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. There are three possible outcomes. You have to memorize these for these two populations on either side of this fork of populations that are diverging from one another. You can have a reinforcement of this divergence, and that most often comes when there's like really good environmental, I guess, characteristics that are helping organisms in their current environment in each of the populations. You'd like to think that the populations are different. Sorry, the environment is different for these populations. Example would be at the north rim of the Grand Canyon is 1,000 feet higher and gets much more snow than the southern rim of the Grand Canyon. And so each population is going to have characteristics that help them survive in those situations. And that could become reinforced over time, and you've got two populations here. Or you can have stability, and again, I guess if they're well adapted in their current environment, they're not necessarily having characteristics reinforced to continue to diverge. They're just like, okay, we're well adapted. We have a gap between us as far as being able to reproduce and our allele frequencies of different alleles, and we're just going to keep them. Or they could fuse back together, and there's a couple of examples in your book about these frogs that this happens to. The problem with fusion often is when the populations get back together, there is some kind of divergence in the gene pool, and what happens is then you get these kind of funky babies, like you'll read like this spine is fused, they have lower reproductive rates. There's just always a cost for populations that have gone apart for a while, we're talking probably thousands of years, and then they try to come back together. But they can, if those, and so okay, so then if they're going to reproduce, and all of a sudden those individuals that are the hybrids are actually strong, then you could have a breakdown of this fork, and the populations can fuse back together, and that's what you see. Please define the term hybrid zone. Describe the three outcomes for hybrid zones over time. Press pause. You're going to need to know this for sure. Next, I'd like you to teach your neighbors or your favorite stuff here. Because you always remember 95% of what you can teach to someone else who's conscious and trying to learn that concept. It's super important to teach other people stuff. Well, the other type of speciation that they talk about in 24.2 is this type way over here on the right called sympatric speciation. And it literally means same country speciation. You can see there, they're not geographically isolated, these fish that are in this lake. It takes place in geographically overlapping populations. They may become new species right next to one another. This is, you'd like to think that this is rare in animals, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples in just a moment. Polyploidy is really the most common way that this happens. About 80% of the plants that we see these days on our planet are polyploids, which means they have more than two sets of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. And this usually results from some sort of error that occurred in the creation of eggs or sperm through meiosis. Like a whole set of chromosomes went over, and we've talked about this before, like this one, there was this one desert rat that has 3N, or a triploid amount of chromosomal sets. We're talking about sets of chromosomes here. Oats, cotton, potatoes, tobacco, and wheat are all polyploids. I think we talked about bananas and strawberries also being polyploid. Polyploidy is the presence of an extra set of chromosome or chromosomes due to accidents during cell division. Failure of cell division after chromosome duplication gives rise to tetraploids like this one right here. Well, here's an example of an animal that does have Polyploidy. This is a type of, frogs and toads are different. I want to call it a frog. I'm not going to call it a toad. It has a tetraploid, and this is I don't understand this thing so much, but the point is you can see lots of stuff that have gone down here, and as a result, we now have this tetraploid animal that has 4 sets of chromosomes in each one of its cells. Here's another example that your book is going to talk about. There was this type of fruit fly that would infest hawthorn berries. This is in New England. Everything was fine. It was well adapted to its environment, but its environment changed when European colonists brought over these apples that would ripen more quickly than the hawthorn berries. Well, there was a subpopulation of these flies that would also mature more quickly than the others in their population, and they were able to infest those apples. They then got some other mutations that helped them to kind of transfer over to apples rather than hawthorn berries, which are kind of hard and they take a long time to ripen. And the point is after a while, even though they were in the same area, these two populations of flies actually diverged from one another, and you had sympatric speciation. Here's a picture of apple maggots. I thought those are the babies before they get wings and are able to. Thought I would just show that to you. There's also another example in your book of these cichlid fish that live in Lake Victoria. This is in Africa. And these fish, about 100,000 years ago, came from local lakes and streams to this huge lake. It's a massive lake that spans 3 countries, and you can see that there. Well, what happened was that over a span of 100,000 years, there was about 600 different species of this cichlid fish that had evolved into these 600 species. And it was due to either one of 2 things scientists believe. Number one, either it was like specialized for different food sources at different parts of the lake, or number 2, that the lake was really turbid and that the females couldn't see very well, and there was this monochromatic light, and then the individuals had different coloration patterns in different areas of the lake, and so the females were either turned on or turned off by certain colors, and so they would actually, I guess it was behavioral isolation, the behavior would be the coloration. They would either like or not like these individuals, and then they would reproduce with only some or not the others. And the point is that over time, you got all these different species swimming and living right next to each other, which is pretty cool. Go ahead and please go over these. I'll press pause. Sorry, you press pause. So only a couple more concepts that we have to go over. So how long does this take to happen? Well, how many genes need to differ between species in order for this to happen? Well, the answer, of course, is 4,000 years in the example of these cichlid fish to super well adapted for their environment insects, specifically some beetles. 40 million years, science believes that it takes for some beetles to speciate into 2 new species. Talk about being well adapted for your environment. They're under pressure now with the warming of our planet, for sure. Average is about 6.5 million years for a new species to take place. How many genes does it take? Well, it's few or many genes. I guess with the beetles, it would be many genes then. The fossil record includes examples of species that appear suddenly, persist essentially unchanged for some time, and then apparently disappear. So there's 2 theories here. There's a theory of punctuated equilibrium or gradualism in terms of if we were going to kind of graphically represent or draw out what speciation looked like, and I'll show you the picture of it in a second. Is it super gradual, or is it an equilibrium for a long time and then it punctuates with change and then it equilibriums again? Here's the punctuated pattern. You can see where these individuals are well adapted to their environment, and then all of a sudden they speciate into something new. This is called punctuated equilibrium. Describes periods of apparent stasis punctuated by sudden change. Or is it gradual? Is it predictable? Can scientists say, well, I'm looking at this butterfly now, and I know in 1.6 million years, it's going to change into a brand new species. And then 1.6 million years after that, another species. Is it a gradual pattern? Can we see the mutations piling up over time. This is different than the model of gradual change in species existence. I don't know why that's there. I stand by everything I put up here, but it's good. Anyway, which one is correct? It's this one, punctuated equilibrium. I must have just added that in right now. My bad. Well, how many genes does it take? Well, it takes many genes, maybe in the case of beetles, but as we showed in 24.1, it could just be one single allele in terms of creating a spiral and a shell going the opposite direction. Go ahead, press pause, go over these concepts, please. So settle in, we're gonna watch a 14-minute movie. It's pretty good. I'm gonna ask you a question on the exam from this movie. Don't memorize anything, just watch it and enjoy and learn. Thanks. If you like a better kind of, I guess, reproduction of this movie, it will be on my learning platform.
It's a basic human need to ask, who are we? Where do we come from? How did we get here? Why do we look the way we do?
The story of our evolution is just a small chapter in a much larger story. The evolution of all living things.
Evolution shows us that we're much more connected to the rest of the world, the rest of animal life, than we could ever have imagined.
We can recognize the connection to our closest relatives, but when we know how to look, we can also find it in other mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, even insects. The deeper we dig, the farther back we go, the more we see that everything alive has evolved from a single starting point. The tree of life has been branching for 4 billion years. And we can now follow its branches back to their roots.
When we look back over time, we find certain signposts, certain key events, the great transformations, the big evolutionary steps.
In the history of our planet, a few great transformations have opened the door for new ways of life and new forms of life. 50 million years ago, land mammals evolved into sea creatures. Long before that, fish colonized land. At the dawn of animal life itself, the first bodies appeared. These are some of the chapters in life's story. Our story.
And part of the fun of studying this is understanding each different chapter. Because by understanding those chapters, we can begin to see the unity of life, the common history of all life on Earth.
Human civilization stretches back thousands of years. But compared to the age of the Earth, we humans have only just arrived.
The Earth is really old. If you take the entire history of the Earth from 4.6 billion years ago to the present, and to recall that an hour, the first 50 minutes are largely spent in a world of microbes, single-celled organisms. Animal life appeared in the last 10 minutes of that hour. All of human history, our civilization, our evolution, happened in the last 100th of a second of that hour.
We've come quite late to the party. but we've been shaped by the same forces that have helped shape all life on Earth. To understand how we fit in, we need to look back to long before our own origins to see how other living things evolved. Whales are the largest living animals. Like us, whales and dolphins took on their present forms relatively recently. For a long time, the origin of these marine mammals was a scientific mystery.
Whales are so different from every other kind of mammal that we can't easily relate them to anything else, and so they're off by themselves as a branch of mammal evolution.
Mammals first appeared on Earth around 200 million years ago, on land. Mammals are warm-blooded. They give birth to living young, and they breathe air. These are all adaptations to living on land. But whales and dolphins are mammals too.
They're mammals that live in the water. But we know that mammals evolved on land. So it's a real puzzle how whales originally evolved. By understanding how that happens, we'll begin to understand how these big jumps, these big transformations happen generally.
People are interested in whales, and I can understand. They're so beautiful. Their origin is such a mystery. Whales are one of the few groups of mammals that have really large, complicated brains like we do. And so in a sense, there are alter egos living in the sea while we live on land, dominating the sea while we dominate land. And I think for that reason, we're very interested in what goes on there, how they got there as a reflection of our own history through geological time.
When Phil Gingrich began his career 30 years ago, he knew nothing about whales, and that was just fine with him. He was drawn to geology mostly because he couldn't imagine a career spent behind a desk.
I think I was interested in geology because it was a science outdoors. And in geology, I became interested in paleontology because it was about life and the history of life.
Gingrich's early interest in primitive land mammals eventually took him to Pakistan. It was there that he made the kind of find most paleontologists only dream about. A fossil that would rewrite one of evolution's greatest stories.
I found the back of a skull that I couldn't identify. It had a very good, well-preserved ear region, and that offered the clue to what it was.
The shape was familiar, but in other ways it was like nothing Gingrich had ever seen.
This is the original specimen. It's the one we found in about 1978. There are several things that strike you. One is it's very similar in size and shape to the back of a skull of a wolf.
But there was something odd about this skull. On its underside was a walnut-sized bump.
If this wasn't here, I would think that this was an archaic carnivorous mammal, what we call a creodont. But it is here.
It was part of the animal's inner ear, and it had a distinctive shape. A shape found today in only one kind of animal. Whales. What was the ear of a whale doing on the skull of an animal that resembled a wolf? Gingrich was intrigued, so he constructed a model of what the creature's full skull might have looked like. He wondered, was his find a crucial missing link? The first fossil evidence ever found for one of Darwin's most daring claims, that whales had evolved from land mammals. To know for sure, Gingrich would need to find more fossils. Ones that would show each stage of the whale transformation, what scientists call transitional forms.
I want to line them all up. I want anyone to be able to see it and believe it because they've seen it.
Gingrich tried to return to Pakistan to resume his search, but war had broken out and the borders were closed. Frustrated, Gingrich decided to look elsewhere. He had heard stories about whale skeleton sightings in a very unlikely place. So he decided to check it out for himself. The Sahara Desert is one of the driest places on Earth. But 40 million years ago, things here were quite different.
This used to be the sea. Just think of this being the current Mediterranean coast of Egypt backed up about 40 million years, about 100 kilometers to the south where it is today.
Here, in what had once been the southern Mediterranean Sea, is a 100 square mile stretch of layered sandstone with a surprising name: Valley of the Whales. The name is well suited. Scattered everywhere across this arid landscape are what look like heaps of rose-colored stones.
Here's a Basilosaurus.
But they're not stones.
You can see how big the vertebrae are. Here's a lumbar partly weathered away.
They are whale skeletons, 40 million years old.
There's another one back here coming out of the mushroom. There's one over here. And back over there is one. This whole place is full of whales.
Why were there so many whales concentrated in this one spot? Gingrich believes that Whale Valley was once a protected bay, a lagoon hidden from the open sea by underwater sandbars. Perhaps the whales birthed their young here and came here to die. But even with hundreds of whale bones at his feet, Gingrich was disappointed. Nearly all of the skeletons belonged to a whale called Basilosaurus, a 40 million year old creature already known to science. Basilosaurus lived full time in the water. If whales had evolved from land mammals, they had done so long before Basilosaurus. So Gingrich didn't think that bones would be of much interest. But he couldn't have been more wrong. After only a few days of digging, he made his second amazing find. It turned out that Basilosaurus had something modern whales have long since lost.
For the first time, we've got whales that have legs.
The bones were small but unmistakable. A pelvis, a kneecap, even toes. This whale had a complete set of leg bones. Gingrich brought back as much of the skeleton as he could carry. It was dramatic evidence that whales had once been four-legged animals. Since Gingrich's finds, he and others have filled in more of this fantastic story. Scientists now think that the earliest ancestor of whales was similar to this 50 million year old wolf-like mammal called Synonyx. Synonyx was a predatory scavenger that lived and hunted along the shores of an ancient sea. Perhaps its descendants found the water a source of abundant food and a haven from competition. Over millions of years, front legs became fins, rear legs disappeared, bodies lost fur, and took on their familiar streamlined shape. Since Gingrich's first find, named Pakicetus, the list of known transitional whales has grown. It now includes Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, Durodon, as well as Basilosaurus. They reveal another element of whale evolution, the gradual migration of nostrils to the top of the head as whales adapted to breathing in the water.
How did whales lose their legs?
As the years went by, they evolved into newer types of.
Gingrich's work demonstrates what Darwin himself insisted, that the evidence for evolution is all around us if we choose to look for it.
Okay, thanks. Remember to water your plants and vote in the next election, please. Thanks for your attention, everyone. I hope you found that interesting.